The letter arrived without a name. It was delivered on a cold evening in the winter of 1871, slipped beneath the door of a boarding house in Lower Manhattan while the city slept beneath a skin of fog and coal smoke. No one saw who brought it. No footsteps echoed on the stairwell. No knock announced its presence. It was simply there, an envelope of thick, yellowed paper, sealed with black wax, bearing a symbol no one in the house recognized. Inside was a single sentence, written in a precise, disciplined hand. If you wish to know what truly happened in this country before it learned how to lie to itself, come alone. There was no signature, only an address. At the time, America was still pretending to heal. The Civil War had ended 6 years earlier, but the wounds were not closing. Cities were growing faster than their morals. Railroads cut across stolen land like open scars. Wealth was concentrating in the hands of men whose names would soon be spoken with reverence, while entire families disappeared into factories, mines, and forgotten graves. History books were already being written, but quietly edited. What most Americans did not know was that the most dangerous events of the century had never made it into print. They existed only in private journals, burned archives, sealed court records, and the memories of men who drank themselves into silence. One of those men was Elias Crow. Crow was not famous. He had never held office. He had never commanded an army. Yet for 30 years he had been present, quietly, invisibly, at moments when the nation shifted course. He had served as a clerk, a translator, a witness, a courier, the kind of man history used and then forgot. By 1871, Crow was tired. His hands trembled when he drank. His sleep was broken by dreams that smelled of iron and smoke. He had outlived nearly everyone who shared his secret, and that, more than guilt, frightened him. Because secrets, when held too long, begin to rot. Crow knew the address on the letter by heart. He had memorized it decades earlier, back when the building was something else entirely, before the fire, before the disappearance, before the official explanation that never quite explained anything. The next night, he went. The building stood at the edge of the city, where streets gave way to warehouses and the rivers swallowed sound. It had no sign. Its windows were dark, yet the door was unlocked, as if expecting him. Inside, the air was cold and dry, like a church that had forgotten its God. A man waited at a table beneath a single oil lamp. He was younger than Crow, but his eyes carried an old, deliberate patience. On the table lay a stack of documents bound with string, their edges burned and repaired, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to erase them. "You're late," said the man. Crow did not ask how he knew him. "You shouldn't have found me," Crow replied. "We didn't," the man said. "You found yourself." That was when Crow understood. This was not a threat. It was a reckoning. The man introduced himself only as Matthew Hale. He represented no newspaper, no court, no government agency. In fact, he claimed to distrust all three. What he wanted was not publication, at least not yet, but confirmation. There are events in this country's past that were buried so deeply they changed the way power behaves. I believe you were there. Crow laughed bitterly. "Everyone believes something," he said. Hale slid one document across the table. Crow's laughter stopped. It was a shipping ledger dated 1838. He recognized the handwriting immediately, his own. The entries were coded, disguised as agricultural equipment and medical supplies, but Crow knew what they really listed. Human cargo, unregistered transfers, people who officially never existed. "You kept copies," Hale said. "You weren't supposed to." "I was never supposed to survive," Crow replied. Silence stretched between them. Outside, a ship's horn sounded on the river, long, low, mournful. Crow's mind drifted backward, past the war, past the cities, past the speeches and flags, back to a time when the nation was younger, crueler, and far more honest about what it was willing to do to survive. It began, he said, in the 1820s. Back then, America was obsessed with expansion, not just land, but control, information, silence. The government feared rebellion, foreign influence, and internal collapse, and so, quietly, it authorized something that had no name, a program designed to remove problems before they became visible. Not prisons, not executions, disappearances. Crow was 22 years old when he was recruited, smart enough to read several languages, poor enough to accept, invisible enough to be forgotten if something went wrong. He was told it was temporary, necessary, patriotic. He was told it would save lives. At first, the targets were clear: smugglers, agitators, foreign agents, men without families, people no one would miss. But over time, the definitions blurred. A preacher who spoke too loudly, a printer who refused to alter a pamphlet, a woman who knew too much about a shipment that never officially arrived. They were moved at night, logged under false categories, sent west, south, or nowhere at all. The system grew efficient, clean, almost bureaucratic, and that was the most terrifying part. Because once a nation learns how to erase its own people quietly, it never forgets the skill. Crow stopped. Hale leaned forward, his face pale. "You're saying," he whispered, "that long before the war, before Reconstruction, before any of this, America perfected the art of making people vanish." Crow nodded. "And worse," he said, "it learned to convince itself it was righteous for doing so." The lamp flickered. Somewhere in the building, wood creaked, as if someone else had shifted their weight in the dark. Crow realized too late that this meeting had never been about history. It was about inheritance, because the systems he helped build had not died in the 1800s. They had only changed their names. Crow did not remember standing up from the chair, only the sensation of his knees locking as if they no longer trusted the floor beneath him. Matthew Hale extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Crow wondered if this was how it ended, not with a bullet or a rope, but with a quiet closing of light. But then a second lamp flared to life at the far end of the room, revealing a narrow corridor lined with shelves. "Follow me," Hale said. The corridor was deeper than it should have been. The building, from the outside, appeared modest, 2 stories at most, yet they walked downward, step after step, the walls narrowing, the air growing cooler. Crow felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced decades earlier whenever he entered places that were not meant to exist. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a vault. The room was circular, its brick walls scarred by age and moisture. Iron cabinets stood against the walls, each marked with faded numbers. On a long table in the center lay stacks of journals, maps, and sealed envelopes. Some were marked with dates, others bore only symbols. "This is what remains," Hale said. "What wasn't burned, what wasn't sunk, what people were too afraid to destroy." Crow reached out and touched the spine of a journal. His hand trembled. "I watched men throw these into rivers," he said. "I signed orders to burn them." "And yet," Hale replied, "here they are." Crow turned to him slowly. "Then you already know more than you should." "Enough to know," Hale said, "that you're not the villain of this story. You're the witness." That word, witness, cut deeper than any accusation. Crow sat, and he began again, this time further back. In the 1820s, the program had no formal structure. It existed as a series of permissions whispered between offices, letters written in deliberately vague language, funds redirected under innocuous labels. There was no single architect, only a shared understanding among powerful men that certain problems could not be solved publicly. America was fragile then, surrounded by empires, divided internally, obsessed with destiny. Fear traveled faster than news, and rumor was often treated as truth. Crow was assigned to ports first: New Orleans, Charleston, Boston. His job was simple: record arrivals that were not to be recorded, departures that never happened. People arrived under one name and left under another, or did not leave at all. The first time he realized something was wrong, it was a child. A boy of maybe 10, thin as wire, eyes too old for his face. He arrived with two men who claimed to be relatives. Their paperwork was flawless, too flawless. Crow had learned to recognize forged documents by their perfection. When he questioned them, one of the men smiled and said, "You don't want to know." The boy said nothing. He never cried, never resisted. Crow logged the transfer. That night, he drank until dawn. He never saw the boy again. Years later, Crow learned that the child had been taken west, placed in one of several educational facilities that did not appear on any map, places designed to reshape identity, to remove language, memory, resistance. The government never called them camps. They called them solutions. By the 1830s, the program had evolved. It now had layers, compartments, redundancies. No single person could see the whole structure, which made it easy for everyone involved to believe they were only doing a small, necessary part. Crow was promoted. He was sent inland to settlements barely held together by law. There he witnessed a different kind of disappearance, not the quiet removal of individuals, but the erasure of entire records. Towns that existed on census rolls one year and vanished the next. Churches with no burial grounds, families whose names appeared once and never again. When Crow asked questions, he was told the land needed them gone. He learned not to ask again. By the time the 1840s arrived, the system had begun to intersect with commerce, railroads, banks, private interests. What had started as a national security measure became a tool, one that could be rented. If a man stood in the way of progress, he could be removed. If a community resisted a project, it could be scattered. If a truth threatened profit, it could be buried beneath paperwork and time. Crow's handwriting appeared everywhere. That, more than anything, haunted him. In the vault, Hale listened without interrupting. Only once did he stop Crow, sliding forward a document Crow had not yet mentioned. "This," Hale said, "is dated 1849. Crow stared at it, his breath caught. He had hoped that year would remain buried. 1849 was chaos. Gold had been discovered, and the nation lost its mind. People flooded west with no laws to restrain them, no patience for obstacles. In that chaos, the program expanded faster than ever. Crow was stationed at a temporary office near the frontier. The orders were explicit: stabilize the region by any means necessary. That was when the disappearances stopped being selective. Entire groups vanished. Prospectors who refused to sell, surveyors who returned with the wrong reports, witnesses to violence that was not meant to be acknowledged. Crow protested once, just once. His superior had looked at him calmly and said, "History is not written by the innocent, it's written by the effective." The final straw came weeks later. A woman arrived at the office demanding answers about her husband. She had his letters, his last known route, proof that he should have arrived. Crow checked the ledger. Her husband had been marked with a single symbol, one that meant removal without relocation. He told her he would investigate. He did not. That night, he altered records, not to erase the truth, but to preserve it. Copies hidden inside other files, ledgers mislabeled, journals bound as shipping manifests. It was treason, but it was the only rebellion he knew to commit. When Crow finished, the vault was silent except for the faint drip of water from somewhere unseen. Hale exhaled slowly. "You're describing a machine, one that predates the war, one that didn't end with it." Crow nodded. "The war didn't create it. The war justified it." Hale stood and walked to one of the cabinets. He opened it and removed a bundle of letters tied with red string. "These," he said, "are dated after your retirement." Crow frowned. "I retired in 1856. "Officially," Hale replied, "but the signatures continue." Crow took the letters with shaking hands. The handwriting was not his, but the codes were identical. Someone had inherited his work. Someone had refined it. Crow felt a cold certainty settle over him. "They didn't need me anymore," he said softly. "They needed the system." A sound echoed above them, footsteps, faint but deliberate. Hale stiffened. "You said this place was secure," he whispered. "It was," Hale replied, "until tonight." The footsteps paused directly overhead. Crow understood then why the letter had been unsigned, why Hale had sought him out now after so many years. This was not an interview. It was a final transmission. Hale gathered the documents quickly, his movements precise. "They're closer than I expected," he said, "which means you were right." "About what?" Crow asked. "That the past doesn't stay buried. It waits." The light flickered. Above them, a door creaked open, and somewhere in the building, a voice spoke Crow's name, slowly, carefully, as if tasting it. Crow closed his eyes. The machine was still running, and it had found him again.
The voice above them spoke again, closer this time, its calmness more disturbing than any shout. "Mr. Crow," it said, "you've been difficult to reach." Hale moved first. He pulled Crow toward a narrow passage behind one of the iron cabinets and pressed a hidden latch. Stone scraped against stone, and a section of the wall slid inward just enough to reveal a stairwell descending into darkness. "Go," Hale whispered. "Do not stop." Crow hesitated. "You'll come?" Hale met his eyes. For the first time since they had met, the younger man's composure cracked, not with fear, but with something like resignation. "I was never meant to leave," Hale said. "I was meant to make sure you remembered." Another footstep sounded, heavier now. Keys jingled. Someone was in no hurry. Crow stepped into the stairwell. The wall slid shut behind him with a final, suffocating sound. The stairs spiraled downward far longer than any rational structure should allow. The air grew damp. The smell changed from old paper and dust to earth and rusted iron. Crow's breath rasped in his chest as memories surfaced uninvited. He had walked stairwells like this before. In 1834, beneath a courthouse that officially had no basement. In 1841, under a hospital wing that burned 2 months later. In 1850, below a rail depot where the ground itself seemed to swallow sound. Always the same design, always the same logic. The machine reused its blueprints. At the bottom, the stairwell ended in a tunnel reinforced with timber. Crow followed it blindly until he saw light, faint, gray, natural. The tunnel opened behind a warehouse near the river, its exit concealed by stacked crates and rotting canvas. Crow emerged into the night just as shouts echoed behind him. He did not look back. The city above ground continued as if nothing had happened. Carriages rattled over cobblestone, a drunk laughed somewhere, a woman sang softly from a window. Life went on, ignorant and intact, while beneath it, men were hunted for remembering too much. Crow moved through alleys and side streets until his lungs burned. Only when he reached the river's edge did he stop, gripping a railing as his vision blurred. Hale was dead. He knew it with the certainty of experience. The machine never left loose ends, and now it had turned its attention fully to him. Crow disappeared that night. At least, that was what the city would have believed. His boarding house found his room empty. His belongings remained untouched. No body was discovered. No report was filed. But Crow did not flee the country. He went where the machine least expected him to go, into its own shadow. For weeks, he moved between forgotten towns, using old routes and older names. He sought out men who had once stood where he stood now, clerks, messengers, guards, those who had served and been discarded. Most were gone, dead by drink, disease, or despair. A few still lived. They spoke in fragments, in half-sentences, in glances over shoulders, even in empty rooms. Each carried the same story, distorted by time but unmistakably connected. One man, a former rail accountant, told Crow something that chilled him more than any document. "It stopped being government-owned years ago," the man said, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey he could barely afford. Crow pressed him. "Who?" The man shook his head violently. "Names don't survive long," he whispered. "Structures do." That was when Crow understood the final evolution of the machine. It no longer needed orders, it needed incentives. Banks funded relocations disguised as foreclosures. Rail companies transported unregistered passengers in exchange for land rights. Factories absorbed laborers who officially never arrived. Local authorities cooperated because cooperation brought stability, and stability brought money. The machine had merged with progress. By the time Crow reached the Midwest, winter had begun to settle in. Snow covered roads, erasing tracks. He stayed in a town that did not appear on most maps, working briefly as a school clerk. There, he encountered something he had not expected. A child. The boy could not have been more than 12. Dark hair, watchful eyes, too quiet. Crow noticed him because the boy never spoke in class, never wrote his name, never misbehaved. He existed in a perfect state of compliance. One afternoon, Crow found him lingering after school. "You don't have to stay," Crow said gently. The boy looked up. "You wrote my number wrong," he said. Crow froze. "What number?" The boy stepped closer and whispered, "The only one that decides where I go next." Crow felt the room tilt. "Who told you that?" he asked. "They don't tell, they show." Crow dismissed the class early that day. He questioned the town registrar. The boy's records were immaculate and meaningless. No birthplace, no parents, no arrival date. That night, Crow broke into the registrar's office and searched the older files. He found the symbol, the same one he had seen in 1849, removal without relocation. The boy was scheduled to disappear. Crow did not sleep. At dawn, he took the boy and left town. They traveled by foot, wagon, and freight car, always one step ahead of official notice. The boy never asked where they were going. He only asked one question, once. "Did you choose this?" he asked. Crow knew what he meant. "No," he said, "but I can choose now." For the first time in decades, Crow acted not as a witness, but as a defiance. They reached a settlement beyond formal jurisdiction, a place of refugees, outcasts, and those who had slipped through history's fingers. There, Crow left the boy with people who asked no questions and recorded no names. As he turned to leave, the boy spoke again. "They won't stop," he said. Crow nodded. "I know." "And neither will you," he said. It was not a question. Crow returned east alone. He understood now what Hale had tried to give him, not safety, but continuity. The truth did not need to be shouted.
it needed to survive. Crow began writing, not memoirs, not confessions, instructions. He encoded what he knew into stories, trade manuals, shipping guidelines, texts that appeared harmless but carried patterns recognizable to only those who had lived inside the machine. He scattered them across states, professions, and decades. And then, one winter morning, Crow felt the familiar pressure in his chest again, the sense of being observed, the sense of being measured. The machine had adapted. It always did. The knock came just after sunrise. Crow did not answer. By the time the door was forced open, the room was empty. On the desk lay a single envelope, sealed with black wax, bearing a symbol that meant nothing to those who found it and everything to those who understood. Inside was a sentence written in a steady, deliberate hand. You cannot erase what has learned to hide.
Years passed. Official records would later claim that Elias Crow died quietly somewhere along the Ohio River, another nameless casualty of age and obscurity. There was a burial entry, a paid undertaker, even a modest gravestone placed where no one ever visited. None of it was true. Crow understood, better than most, that death on paper was the safest form of life. He moved as a ghost moves, through margins, through absences. He worked under borrowed names, stayed in places where questions were considered impolite, and learned to listen more than he spoke. What he watched in those years was not merely the survival of the machine, but its refinement. By the late 1850s, it no longer relied on secrecy alone. It relied on disbelief. America was changing. Newspapers multiplied. Speeches grew louder. Moral language flooded public life. And yet, paradoxically, the more the nation talked about freedom, the easier it became to hide its contradictions. Crow saw how the machine learned to exploit that noise. Disappearances were no longer framed as removals. They were reframed as accidents, as migrations, as unfortunate consequences of progress. A man vanished near a rail line, he must have fallen beneath a train. A family disappeared after refusing to sell land, they must have moved west. A community dissolved overnight, disease perhaps, or bad luck. The machine did not argue. It allowed the public to invent its own explanations. Then came the war. Crow had known it was inevitable long before the first shot was fired. He had seen the numbers shift, the transport routes multiply, the sudden urgency in coded correspondence. War was not merely conflict, it was opportunity. During the war, the machine expanded openly for the first time, cloaked in necessity. Emergency powers blurred boundaries. Oversight vanished beneath urgency. Men were detained, relocated, reclassified, and lost in bureaucratic fog. Crow watched as entire lists of names were absorbed into military records and never emerged again. And when the war ended, the machine did not retreat. It learned something vital. That fear, once normalized, does not require explanation. Reconstruction brought hope on the surface, but beneath it, a different architecture formed. Systems designed to manage instability, to prevent unrest, to maintain order. Crow followed the money. He learned which banks underwrote relocation contracts, which insurers profited from missing persons, which industrial firms required a steady supply of labor that arrived without documentation and left without trace. The machine was no longer centralized, it was distributed. That made it indestructible. In 1866, Crow encountered a document that confirmed his worst suspicion. It was a private memorandum circulated among investors, written in the language of efficiency and risk mitigation. It spoke of population adjustment, unregistered mobility, and containment of disruptive elements. There was no mention of government. That absence was deliberate. Power, Crow realized, had learned to remove itself from blame by removing itself from visibility. The machine had matured. Crow grew older. His hands stiffened, his eyesight faded, but his memory remained sharp, sharpened by urgency. He knew he was running out of time, not because the machine would catch him, but because knowledge, if not passed on, decays into myth. So he chose carefully. He did not seek journalists, they were too exposed. He did not seek politicians, they were too compromised. Instead, he looked for archivists, clerks, librarians, those who preserved rather than proclaimed. People who understood that history is shaped as much by what is omitted as by what is written. To them, he left fragments, a ledger mislabeled, a marginal note in a census roll, a shipping manifest with impossible numbers. Individually, meaningless. Together, undeniable. The machine noticed. Crow sensed it first in the delays, letters that arrived already opened, inquiries that reached him before he sent them. Then in the encounters, strangers who knew his habits, officials who used outdated names with unsettling accuracy. The final warning came in 1870. A woman approached him in a public square, her face unremarkable, her voice calm. "You've lived longer than expected." Crow did not respond. "You're not being hunted, you're being studied." That was worse. "Why now?" Crow asked. "Because," she said, "you represent a flaw." She explained nothing further. She did not need to. Crow understood. The machine did not fear rebels, it feared continuity of memory. It feared people who knew not only what had been done, but how it had evolved. Crow was proof that the past could trace a line into the present. That night, he made his final preparations. He gathered what remained of his documents, not to protect them, but to disperse them. He placed them in places where destruction would require explanation: churches, universities, private collections owned by rival interests. He made himself too costly to erase quietly. Then, as winter returned to the city, Crow wrote one last letter, not to a person, to the future. He did not accuse, he did not plead, he simply described patterns, structures, incentives. He wrote not of villains, but of systems that reward forgetting. And then he vanished again, this time completely. No witnesses, no records, no grave. Years later, when investigators stumbled across anomalies, names that appeared twice and then never again, towns that dissolved without disaster, populations that declined without cause, they dismissed them as errors, until the errors began to align, until someone noticed the symbols, until someone received an unsigned letter with black wax and a sentence that felt less like an invitation, more like a burden. The machine, after all, had never been designed to be destroyed. It had been designed to be inherited. And somewhere in America, long after Elias Crow ceased to exist, someone opened a door, stepped into the dark, and learned what the country had decided never to remember.
By 1872, the country had moved on, or at least that was what everyone wanted to believe. The post-war streets of New York teemed with energy, commerce, and ambition, while the machinery Crow had once served and then tried to undermine continued its quiet operation, invisible yet persistent. Crow himself had not been seen. Some said he had died on the river, others whispered he had fled west, but in truth he had become a phantom of his own creation, moving among the forgotten, carrying the burden of memory that the world refused to keep. He traveled to remote towns, libraries, and small communities, delivering fragments of his knowledge. Carefully, subtly, he encoded the truth into innocuous forms, a ledger here, a journal there, even a school primer with marginal notes. Anyone with the patience to piece them together could follow the trail, but most would not notice. Most could not see what had been buried beneath centuries of narrative. Crow's work had evolved from documentation to survival.
He realized that the machine he had helped build was no longer a tool of punishment. It had become a framework of society itself. Government agencies, industrialists, finance seeders, even local authorities now participated unconsciously in a system that rewarded compliance and punished knowledge. Those who saw too much simply disappeared or were redirected to lives no one remembered. And yet, the machine had a flaw. It required memory to function. Its efficiency depended not merely on removing people, but on ensuring that some knowledge persisted, hidden, encoded, fragmented. Without memory, it would eventually devour itself, eliminating the very records it relied upon to operate. Crow became the keeper of that memory. He lived under borrowed names, in empty rooms, in towns that no longer appeared on maps. He carried the ledger of disappearances, the journals of transfers, the coded correspondences, all the evidence of the system's design. The burden was immense, and often he wondered if the machine would ever notice him. But it did. In the spring of 1873, while working in a rural archive, Crow sensed its presence. Not a person, but a pattern. Correspondences arrived before he sent them. Clerks mentioned obscure names that should not have existed. Business records aligned in ways that only he could recognize. The machine had grown sentient in a way. It was no longer just structure and procedure. It was awareness, spread through commerce, governance, and social compliance. Crow understood then that the only way to preserve truth was not to fight the machine directly, but to teach it how to survive with integrity. He began leaving instructions, encrypted in plain sight, showing that while the system could erase lives, it could also be steered toward acknowledgement rather than obliteration. He planted the seeds of a moral framework hidden within operational efficiency, a paradox meant to endure long after his own life. And then came the final act. One evening, a young archivist named Jonathan Reed arrived at a library in Providence, Rhode Island. He had followed a series of notes left decades before, scattered in university collections, private estates, and shipping records. The notes led him to a small, locked room behind a false wall. Inside, Reed found journals, ledgers, letters, and maps, all meticulously organized. Crow appeared, not as a ghost, but as a living man, pale and worn, yet unbroken. He spoke once, in a voice shaped by decades of secrets. "History is a machine," he said. "It does not forget. It only misplaces knowledge. What I leave to you is not vengeance, not confession, but guidance. The machine will persist. People will continue to vanish. Records will continue to be altered. But truth, if carried carefully, can survive beneath the surface." Reed listened, awed, as Crow explained the patterns, the symbols, and the coded methods he had used to preserve fragments of lives erased by the machine. Every disappearance, every ledger entry, every forged or lost record was mapped, annotated, and cross-referenced. Crow's final instructions were chillingly clear. Do not seek to destroy it. That is impossible. Do not seek to expose it all at once. The world cannot bear such a revelation. Instead, understand it, preserve it, and intervene when memory can protect lives. The machine is both history and future. Ignore it, and it devours all. Guide it, and it may yet honor those it has consumed. And with that, Elias Crow vanished, truly this time. Reed searched for him, but found no trace. He was left only with the journals, the ledgers, and a chilling understanding of what it meant to live inside a system designed to forget. Decades later, historians would note anomalies in census data, unexplained population shifts, and towns that disappeared from maps. They would debate,
speculate and theorize, but none would ever know the full truth. Because history, Crow had learned, is not written by those who see. It is written by the machine, and those who remember what the machine cannot erase. And somewhere, deep within America's infrastructure, hidden in plain sight, the machine continued its quiet, meticulous operation, aware, adaptive, immortal. And the question remains, who truly controls it, and who is merely living inside its design? For the machine does not sleep, it does not forgive, and it never forgets, except when it chooses to.